I thought I had a happy marriage until I opened my late mother-in-law's music box. Inside was a letter. Not for me, but a truth he buried for years. My husband once loved my sister, and he knew it when he married me. I didn't cry. I just stood there like I'd never existed. If you think this is just another African family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now for more African family stories that cut deep and stay with you. There was a time I thought silence meant peace, until I realized it's where the truth goes to hide. The late morning sun had the soft color of mercy, honeyed and slow. When it slanted through the wide glass windows of the third-floor flat on Independence Avenue in Accra, it crept across the marbled floor, reached the legs of a breakfast chair, and nudged the toes of a woman sitting still at the edge of her dining table, a cup of mint tea forgotten beside her. Liana's world always began with a pencil. Even as a child, she'd sketch through her emotions. Anger became dark, thick charcoal. Joy, a rush of pastel yellow. Silence, ironically, had color too. It was a pale blue like the inside of shells. That morning it started like any other. She had kissed Ethan's cheek as he adjusted his watch, told him, "Text me after your meeting." He smiled, that familiar half-smile he wore when he was both focused and slightly elsewhere. "Don't skip breakfast this time," he had said, tapping the top of her head. She waved him off with mock annoyance, already scrolling through the dozens of comments her readers had left overnight on her latest webcomic, The Whispering Tree. Then, like 100 other mornings, she grabbed her sketch pad, zipped up her shoulder bag, and stepped out into the pulsing heat of the Ghanaian sun. But that morning never completed itself. At the intersection of Ring Road and Oxford Street, a little boy broke from his mother's grasp and darted across traffic. The honk came too late. Liana slammed her brakes, twisting the steering wheel, skidding sideways into the curb with a crunch that echoed through her skull. The boy was safe. Her car, not so much, and her wrist swollen, pulsing. The doctor at Ridge Hospital said soft tissue injury. Nothing serious, but no drawing for a few days. She nodded, dazed, not because of the pain, but because of what the stillness threatened. No drawing meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. And that sometimes was the real accident. She came home with her wrist wrapped in gauze, her spirit oddly fragile. Ethan called once around 3 p.m. to check on her. She didn't pick up. She texted instead, "All good, just resting." It was only half a lie. That evening, Liana stood in the room Ethan's mother had once called her prayer room. Now it was a storage space, unused, paints, a dusty easel, and a large antique wardrobe carved from dark Ghanaian mahogany that Liana had never quite managed to go through since the funeral last year. She didn't mean to open the bottom drawer. She was looking for the old wrist brace she thought might still be in there. Instead, she found a box. Small, wooden, delicately inlaid with patterns of Adinkra symbols. The kind of box that wasn't made for hiding, but for keeping. It played a melody when she opened it. Soft, fragile. Something classical. Perhaps Mozart, or something from the West African highlife music she remembered hearing at her wedding reception. But it wasn't the music that stopped her breath. Inside was a letter, folded once, yellowing slightly along the creases. On the back, "To be opened if I am gone." The handwriting was unmistakably hers, Esther Agyemang, Ethan's mother. Elegant and curling, the kind of script Liana always admired. She stared at it for a long time. Then she sat. There was no dramatic music when she unfolded the letter. No thunderclap. Just the soft wheeze of the ceiling fan and the distant hum of motorbikes on the street below. But when her eyes reached the third line, her pulse forgot its rhythm. "There are sins too old to name and regrets too quiet to scream. I am guilty of both. And I am sorry." Liana blinked, the words blurring. "You must know that your marriage, my darling, is not untouched. Ethan loved Mia before you ever existed in his world. And he knew. He knew she was your sister when he met you." Her hand trembled slightly, but she read on. "I told him it would ruin you both. I told him love built on silence breeds rot. But he said he loved you. That he'd moved on, that it was different now. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps I wanted to believe it too, but I saw her eyes at the wedding, and I heard the words she never said. By the time Liana reached the last line, the words had melted into blur again. Forgive us all, child. We were all pretending something didn't matter when it should have broken everything. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. The silence that followed was so deep it felt holy. The box sat open beside her. The music now faded into a distant hum in her mind. Her fingers rested gently on the letter. Her breathing was shallow, measured. It wasn't the kind of betrayal that came with lipstick on a collar. No phone numbers scribbled on receipts. No midnight messages. This was worse. Deeper, quieter. This was a betrayal buried in the walls of her home. A betrayal that had been politely folded into the seams of her wedding dress. A betrayal with a seat at her family table. Her chest hurt. Not like a punch, but like the collapse of scaffolding she didn't even realize had been holding her up. She thought back to the day she introduced Ethan to Mia. They were at a family beach day in Adafoa. Mia had been playful, loud, throwing sand at everyone. Ethan was reserved. But Liana remembered, yes, she remembered now how Mia had gone quiet when Ethan smiled at her. She had laughed it off then. "You okay?" she asked Mia. "He's just a guy." And Mia, with that crooked half-smile, had said, "Yeah, just a guy." But now it all made sense. The way Ethan always avoided long conversations when Mia visited. The way Mia never stayed over again after the wedding. The way Esther had once gripped her hand tightly, whispering, "You're stronger than you think, Liana," with no apparent context in the kitchen while stirring rice. Liana stood slowly, carefully placing the letter back in the box, then closing the lid with a soft click. She didn't know how long she'd sat there. The sun was lower now, casting long orange shadows across the floor. The room felt colder. She stepped out into the hallway. The walls were covered with framed illustrations from her first graphic novel, Sankofa's Daughters. Strong women in bold colors breaking chains, returning home, lighting fires. She looked at them now and realized she had drawn strength she never thought she'd need. But now she did. She walked into her studio and stared at the sketch on her desk, a smiling woman, with wind in her hair, arms wide open. It felt dishonest now. Fictional in the worst way. Liana tore the page away and threw it in the bin. The silence continued, not weak, not hollow, but loud, pulsing. Ethan wouldn't be home until late. He had a dinner with board members. He had texted earlier, "Don't wait up." She wouldn't. She sat again, this time with a blank page. And for the first time in years, she drew not from joy or wonder or fantasy. She drew from grief, from betrayal, from a voice she hadn't used before. She drew a woman sitting beside a box, and in that box was not just a letter, but the first crack in everything she thought was whole. The morning after finding the letter, Liana didn't sleep. She lay in bed beside Ethan, her body still, but her thoughts unraveling in dark spirals. He was already asleep when she slipped under the covers, breathing slow and easy, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in the air between them. Unaware that the version of her who trusted him without question had died quietly in a wooden prayer room without ceremony or noise. She lay on her side, her back to him, eyes open wide to the ceiling. She counted the soft buzzes of ceiling fan rotations. She could feel the warmth of his body near hers, the familiar outline of his arm, brushing the sheet they shared. It used to be comfort, now it was static. By sunrise, Liana had made a quiet promise to herself she would not confront. She would not accuse. Not yet. She needed proof not just for him, for herself. For the version of her still clinging to the possibility that it was all a mistake. Because hope was a stubborn thing. That morning she sat alone at the edge of their dining table, slowly flipping through a photo album she hadn't opened since the wedding. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of every image. Page 1. The engagement shoot at Aburi Gardens, her in a yellow sundress, Ethan in a crisp white shirt, his smile easy, her laugh frozen mid-air. She stared at their hands clasped, but now she noticed her fingers curled tightly around his, while his grip seemed tentative. Why hadn't she seen that before? Page 2. The family introduction. Ethan standing stiffly next to her father, who was laughing too loudly. Mia off to the side looking at the ground, a drink clutched too tightly in her hand. Liana stared at her sister's expression. Was that sadness? Anger? Regret? She had once thought Mia was just tired, but now she questioned everything. She flipped faster now, page after page. The wedding day. The morning shots of the bride getting dressed. The moment Liana stepped out in her gown, she had looked at Mia first, her maid of honor, expecting a gasp or a smile. The photo showed Mia clapping. But her eyes were wet before the ceremony had even begun. In another frame, just as Ethan and Liana were walking down the aisle, Mia stood at the side, her posture too upright, her lips pressed tight. Back then, Liana had thought her sister was simply overwhelmed with joy. But this morning, something inside her rewrote the story. She found herself staring at a close-up one that had once made her laugh. It was taken just after the vows, when Ethan had slipped the ring onto her finger. Someone had snapped a candid Ethan's head, slightly bowed, and Mia, in the background visible over his shoulder, had turned away, looking down. It had seemed like a throwaway photo once. Now it struck like a blade. She closed the album gently as though afraid of waking something she couldn't put back to sleep. Later that afternoon, with her wrist still aching, and her chest even more so, Liana walked the few blocks to her childhood home in the Atabraca district. The house hadn't changed much, its walls still the same dusty ochre, the air thick with the scent of fried plantains and garden basil. Her father was tending to the small herb garden, and her mother was in the kitchen humming a church hymn. It felt strange to return without calling first. But she didn't want conversation. She wanted quiet, and perhaps memory. Liana, her grandmother's voice rang from the back porch, aged and scratchy like an old record. You look like your mother when she was worried and didn't want to say it. Liana managed a small smile and walked over. Nana Afua sat in her usual spot, white wrapper tied around her chest, feet propped on a stool, a bowl of peeled oranges in her lap. She patted the seat next to her. They sat in silence for a while. The neighborhood buzzed gently in the background. Kids kicking a ball, radios blasting high-life music, a nearby tailor's sewing machine clattering through cloth. It was the kind of familiar noise that usually calmed Liana. But today, everything grated. You ever notice Nana Afua began peeling an orange with arthritic fingers? How the heart can break without a sound, like a clay pot cracking inside before you see the split. Liana turned slowly. Why are you saying that? The old woman smiled. Because your face says you've cracked. But you're still holding the shape. A tear almost escaped. Liana blinked hard and looked away. They sat longer. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of bougainvillea and the faint trace of roasted maize from down the street. Then Nana said it offhand, like a scrap of memory fallen from a shelf. You know your sister once wanted to run away. Long before you got married. She came to me crying, asking how far she'd need to go to forget someone. Liana froze. She said she'd go to Nairobi. Or London. Anywhere far. She said love wasn't fair if it didn't choose you back. Liana's chest tightened. What year was that? She asked carefully. Nana shrugged. Maybe a year before your engagement. I told her the thing about love is if it doesn't free you, it owns you. She didn't speak much after that. Liana nodded slowly. Did she say who it was? No, and I didn't ask. She was already in too much pain. Silence wrapped around them like thick cloth. Liana stood after a few moments. I'm going to check the old study. She stepped inside the house, the familiar groan of the wooden floorboards under her feet. The room she used to do homework in was still lined with old books, stacks of school reports, and forgotten greeting cards. She opened a few drawers, not sure what she was looking for, only knowing she needed to move to touch something. She found an old journal, one of Mia's. It had no lock. Inside were only a few pages filled with poetry. Fragments. You held my hand, but looked away. I laughed too loud to drown the ache. Another. They say we don't get to choose who we love. But what if who we love chooses someone else? It wasn't proof. It wasn't a confession. But it was enough. Liana placed the journal back exactly as she found it. She didn't need to take it. She already carried its weight inside her chest. When she returned to the porch, Nana was dozing, chin to chest. Liana kissed her forehead gently and whispered goodbye. The old woman murmured in her sleep, "Don't forget who you are." Outside, the sun had tilted westward. The streets shimmered with heat. Liana walked slowly, deliberately. Every step seemed heavier than the last. By the time she returned home, Ethan was still out. A note on the counter read, "Dinner with Chairman Owusu. Back late. Love you." Liana didn't touch it. Instead, she entered the studio, stood in front of her blank canvas, and stared at it for a long time. Not every war is loud. Some unfold in the silence of one's own mind, where reality rearranges itself, where love becomes a question, and where family is no longer defined by blood, but by the honesty it can hold. That night, she lay in bed again beside Ethan. This time, his arm curled loosely around her waist, unconscious, automatic. She didn't move. She didn't cry. Her eyes stayed open, fixed on the ceiling as the fan spun overhead. There was no confrontation, no declaration, just the slow, shattering knowledge that trust once broken doesn't scream. It whispers, and she was finally listening. The cafe was loud in the way Accra cafes always were, plates clinking against saucers, fans spinning on low. Someone in the corner laughing too loudly at a phone screen, and gospel music humming somewhere in the background, like an old prayer that didn't know how to stop. Liana sat by the window watching the dusty orange light drip down the street. Her palms folded tightly in her lap, like she was trying to keep her heart from spilling out through her fingertips. Abina arrived 10 minutes late, as always, her short curls bouncing sunglasses perched too high on her head. "Liana," she said, smiling too wide. "Girl, it's been ages." Liana stood, hugged her once, just enough to be polite. "Yeah, it has." They sat, the waiter took their order, and Liana listened to Abena talk about her recent trip to Cape Coast, about the guy she was seeing, who had a child he hadn't told her about until the third date, about the heat wave, about anything and everything that wasn't important. And Liana let her, for exactly 6 minutes. Then she leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes sharp. "I didn't ask you here for small talk, Abena." Abena blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. "Okay. I need to ask you something about Mia." Her fingers tightened around the sugar packet she hadn't opened. "You were her best friend in college, right?" Yeah, I suppose." "Then tell me who she almost left Ghana for." Abena's expression froze. Liana watched her carefully. "Don't lie." "I'm not." "Then don't pretend you don't remember." Abena exhaled slowly and leaned back. Her eyes darted toward the window. She didn't speak for a moment, then said softly, "I knew this would come up one day." "So it's true." Abena nodded, almost imperceptibly. She was in deep. Scary deep. I thought she was going to break. She lost weight, stopped painting, started writing in that green journal all the time. "I saw it," Liana whispered. She didn't want to tell anyone who he was. She called him E. Just the letter. Like she was trying to erase him, but not really. Liana stared into her coffee. "What did he do to her?" Abena's voice dropped. "He left, just like that. One day, everything was intense, like she was floating. And the next, he was gone. No explanation, no call, no goodbye." "She ever say why?" "She said it was guilt. That he wasn't supposed to love her. That it was a mistake. She told me he chose someone else. And I wasn't allowed to ask why." Liana felt her throat go dry. She thought of Ethan's quiet eyes, Mia's retreat from family dinners, the way both of them always managed to never be in the same room for too long. And the pieces began to fit, not like puzzle pieces falling into place, no, like glass shattering in reverse, rising into shape only so they could cut her clean. She forced herself to ask, "Do you think she still loves him?" Abena hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But I do know she's never let go of what happened. She told me once, some betrayals you don't forgive because they take something from you that never grows back." Liana sat back, suddenly exhausted. They didn't talk much after that. When she got home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan was working late again, a message blinking on her phone. Back around 10. Long meeting. "Love you." She didn't reply. Instead, she walked into his study. a room she hadn't stepped into for months. He always kept it clean, minimalistic. One wooden desk, a laptop, a few books. Tidy, silent. Liana stood in front of the desk, then sat slowly. Her fingers hovered over the laptop for a moment before flipping it open. It was password protected, but she knew the code. He had given it to her casually once during tax season. She typed it in Sankofa 18. The screen lit up. Her heart thundered, but she didn't rush. She moved with precision like a surgeon about to cut, like a detective finally inside the killer's home. She clicked the email client. He had cleared most of it out recently, but the archives, thank God, were still there. Years of folders labeled by project names, tax years and subjects like legal dad's surgery, and one called simply other. She opened it. Inside were a handful of old threads. Most were unremarkable conversations with former colleagues, notices about canceled subscriptions. But one thread stopped her cold. The subject line, I saw the photos. You looked happy. Dated a few days after their wedding. Liana clicked it open. The message was short. I saw the photos. You looked happy. I suppose that's what matters now. It's strange, isn't it? To be so close to something you believed in and watch it become someone else's truth. I won't write again. This is goodbye. The one who stepped away when I should have fought. E.M. The one who chose not to be chosen. Liana stared at the screen. Her body didn't move. Her breath didn't falter. But something inside her folded inward. She clicked show thread. There were 2 earlier messages. One from E.M., months before the wedding. Do you think we can ever truly erase the past? You said you've moved on, that you're sure now. I guess I'm asking because I haven't. I still think about her. And Ethan's reply, I told you, Mia, I made my choice. I can't go back. Please don't reach out again. We both knew this couldn't continue. It was always going to end. Liana slammed the laptop shut. The sound startled her too loud, too final. She sat still for a long while, staring at her reflection in the black mirror of the laptop lid. Her mind didn't spin. It sharpened. There it was. Not just proof, not just confirmation. It was a confession made to someone else, never meant for her eyes. And it hurt more precisely because of that. Because it wasn't spoken in regret. It wasn't apology. It was a decision, a cold, calculated rewriting of truth. He had lied. He had lived with her, loved her, married her, all with this old flame flickering in the shadows behind every kiss, every breakfast, every Sunday stroll through Jamestown. She wasn't just second choice. She was the alibi. Liana walked to her studio and sat down in front of a new canvas. She didn't sketch. She just stared. For the first time in her life, the pencil felt foreign in her hand, like a tool someone else had used to draw her into a story she never asked to be part of. A story where her husband was the author, her sister the twist, and she, the beautiful, gullible protagonist. She whispered aloud to no one. I'm not even a character in my own life. And for the first time, it truly sank in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a narrative written long before she arrived. And she had just walked into Act 2, never knowing she was the subplot. The days moved with the pace of a quiet storm. Nothing seemed to break on the outside. But Liana could feel the shift, the slow churn of something inevitable rising beneath her ribs. She carried herself through the house like smoke, soft, untraceable, untouchable. Ethan noticed. She could tell by the way he hesitated at the threshold of rooms, how his eyes lingered a second longer on her, when she thought he'd already looked away. He brought her tea one morning, green, her favorite, slightly too hot. Didn't see you sketching last night, he said, voice easy, cautious. Everything okay? She took the cup without looking at him. I was tired. You didn't sleep. I said I was tired. He didn't press. Instead, he walked out the door with his usual blend of cologne and comfort, leaving a scent trail she had once adored. Now it clung to her like fog, something too familiar, too hard to escape. That afternoon, Liana sat in her studio, surrounded by blank canvases, the ghost of her sketch pad resting on her lap like a secret. Her pencil didn't move, her hand hovered, her thoughts boiled. So she opened her journal instead, a slim leather-bound book she hadn't used since her early 20s, filled with old poems and forgotten drawings. She flipped past all of it and turned to a fresh page. She didn't write much, just one line. Not all betrayal is cruel. Some of it is simply too cowardly to look you in the eye. She stared at the sentence for a long time, then closed the book. The cowardice, that's what stuck in her throat. Not the love he'd buried with her sister. Not even the lie of omission. But the fact that he lived beside her, made breakfast for her, held her in bed, all while pretending that truth wasn't waiting at the bottom of the well. That night they had dinner together. It was Ethan's idea. He said he wanted to cook, claimed it had been a while since they had slowed down. He wore the apron her mother had gifted him at Christmas, the one with the faded jollof stain down the middle. She watched him from across the counter as he stirred stew. Chopped onions, hummed to himself like he didn't know the walls between them were growing inch by inch. They sat at the table under the soft glow of the dining light. Ethan lit a candle. He smiled like everything was still made of gold. She didn't smile back. "You're quiet again," he said. "I'm just watching," she replied. "Watching what?" "You." He chuckled, nervous, unsure. "That's intense." She nodded once, took a bite of her food, swallowed. Then she asked it softly, like asking for the weather. "Did you know Mia before me?" The fork froze halfway to his mouth. His lips parted, but the answer didn't come. He blinked, set the fork down, folded his hands. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean." He looked down, then back at her. "That's out of nowhere." "Is it? Where's this coming from?" She didn't answer. She waited. Ethan scratched his jaw, laughed once tight. "I mean, yeah, I knew of her. It's Ghana. Everyone's connected somehow." "You didn't just know of her. Liana, you knew her. Personally, intimately." His fingers twitched on the table. She watched him. Not his words, his hands, his eyes the hollow between his collarbones. She looked for the cracks he couldn't control. "Why would you think that?" he said at last. She didn't blink. "Because you're lying." "Come on, Liana, that's not fair." "No," she interrupted, still calm. "What's not fair is being made a fool of. What's not fair is living with someone who keeps entire lifetimes folded behind his back." He stood up suddenly, too fast, the chair scraping. "Where is this coming from? Did Mia say something?" Liana sat back, just slightly. "No," she said, "but silence speaks. And you're both fluent." He began to pace. His hand rubbed the back of his neck, a tic she'd catalogued for years, the movement of a man unraveling slowly. "I can't do this right now," he muttered. She stood too, but slower. "You don't have to. I already am." He looked at her then, fully. And for a second she saw it, the boyish guilt, the cornered truth. And then the armor returned. "Liana, you're overthinking things." She tilted her head. Her voice was almost a whisper. "Then answer the question." He hesitated, swallowed. "We met briefly, a long time ago, before I knew she was your sister, before I ever met you." There it was, the half-truth he thought might save him. "And you didn't think it mattered to tell me?" "It didn't look it was a blip. We were never serious. It wasn't a thing. She almost left the country for you." That landed like a slap. His face changed. Just slightly, but it was enough. She nodded as if confirming her own theory. "Don't lie to me anymore, Ethan." He didn't respond. The room pulsed with tension, the candle flickering wildly caught in the draft of their unspoken war. Liana stepped back from the table. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her voice didn't waver. "You should have told me. I could have handled the truth. What I can't handle is being written into a story I didn't audition for." He tried to reach for her, a hand halfway in the air, but she moved around him without touch. "I'm going to bed," she said. He stood still as she walked past. In the hallway, her back straight, her shoulders square. Liana didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply existed, sharp, wide awake, changed. In the bedroom, she changed into her robe, sat at the edge of the bed, and opened her journal again. Another line: "The cruelest part of betrayal is not what it takes from you, but how much of yourself you gave freely to someone who was always holding back." She closed the book, turned off the lamp. When Ethan entered the room 20 minutes later, she was already under the covers, eyes closed back to him. He lay beside her in silence. After a moment, he whispered, "I love you." She didn't answer, but in her mind she wrote something else down. "And still you said that. After everything." like love was enough to rewrite the past. The cafe hadn't changed. Same uneven tables, same chipped ceramic mugs, same weathered wooden beams holding up the tin roof as if faith alone was the glue. It sat quietly at the edge of Jamestown, like a secret only the two of them had ever shared. They used to come here on school breaks. Liana and Mia sip cheap tea-trade boyhood crushes and dreams of moving to Accra and draw pictures of each other on napkins when they had no paper. Now it was a graveyard of everything unsaid. Liana arrived early and chose the corner table beneath the baobab painting. She didn't bring her sketch pad. Today wasn't for drawing. She watched the door. 10 minutes, 15. Then Mia walked in carefully, like someone measuring the weight of their own existence. Her face looked older than Liana remembered, less because of time and more because of wear. Her hair was pulled back in a low knot, exposing every ounce of hesitation in her forehead. She wore a white blouse, too clean, too crisp, like she'd tried to dress in armor, but only managed cotton. Liana raised her hand slightly. Mia approached slowly, sat down, didn't touch the menu. "You ordered already?" she asked. "No," Liana replied. Silence. Not hostile, not warm either. Just tentative. The way bridges feel right before they collapse. "I was surprised when you texted," Mia said. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't." "Why did you?" Mia hesitated, then looked away. "I don't know. Maybe I owe you that." The waitress appeared with 2 cups of mint tea. Liana hadn't ordered, but the waitress remembered. She always remembered. "Still drink it with honey?" Mia asked, trying for something lighter. Liana didn't answer. She stared into the tea as if looking for something more than reflection. "I came here," Liana began softly, not to yell, not to accuse. Mia nodded once. "I came because I wanted to hear you say it." Mia's lips parted, then closed. Liana leaned forward. Her voice was low, almost gentle. "Did you love him?" The question sat between them, naked and cold. Mia stared down at her hands, delicate long fingers that used to paint so freely when they were girls, now clenched together like a prayer. She began, but no words followed. Liana waited. Mia's eyes welled up, but the tears didn't fall. She looked out the window instead. Her voice, when it finally came, cracked like dried leaves. It was the kind of love that only works in shadows. It had no right to want the light. Liana swallowed hard. Mia continued, barely a whisper. "He wasn't mine. Not in any way that mattered. Not when it counted. But yes, I did. And I think a part of me still does. I wish I didn't." There it was. Not a confession, not an apology, just the truth, raw and undecorated. Liana didn't speak. She didn't need to. Mia wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. It was a mistake. The kind that doesn't just ruin a day, it ruins the mirror you see yourself in. Liana nodded slowly, her throat tight. For a moment, the cafe seemed to fall into slow motion. The sound of traffic outside dulled. The clink of dishes disappeared. It was just them. 2 sisters, 2 halves of the same wound. "Do you know what hurts most?" Liana finally asked, voice shaking but clear. "That he chose you. That he didn't have the courage to say it out loud. That both of you let me build a life on silence." Mia closed her eyes, tears slipping free this time. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," Liana said. "That's what makes it worse." Neither of them touched their tea. Minutes passed. No more words were exchanged. Eventually, Liana stood. Mia rose with her. There was no hug. No dramatic goodbye. Just a glance. Sisters walking away from a fire, neither one dared extinguish. Outside, the sky was bruised with sunset. Liana walked the streets of Jamestown with her arms folded tight, wind catching the hem of her coat. Her chest ached, not from heartbreak, but from the weight of knowing too much and being too composed to scream. When she reached home, the house was empty. Ethan was at a business dinner, or so the message on her phone said. She didn't read the rest. She walked straight into her studio and closed the door behind her. Silence. Paints, brushes, canvas, all where she'd left them. She stood in front of the easel for a long time, unmoving. Then, with sudden precision, she pulled out a large canvas, clean and untouched. She mixed her colors slowly. Not in her usual palette of joy or whimsy, but muted golds, bone-white storm gray, and a red so deep it bordered on black. She began with the outline of a bird, its wings spread not in flight, but in panic. Its eye wide, mid-beat, full of a song that could not escape. She painted 2 cages, one on each side, identical, ornate. Open doors, gold bars, but the bird didn't fly. It stayed, trapped between options that looked like freedom, but were both prisons of choice. She painted until the moon rose over the window, until her wrist cramped and her shoulder throbbed. She painted until the tears she hadn't cried dried up inside her. And all that remained were brushstrokes, each one a scream without volume, each color a scar made visible. The painting wasn't finished, but she was. She stepped back, stared at the image, the bird suspended forever between lies dressed as safety, and whispered almost to herself, "This is what betrayal looks like, when it doesn't raise its voice." And then, as if afraid the truth might vanish, she wrote a title in the bottom right corner, between 2 cages. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. It already had her name etched in every layer of paint, every silence she'd swallowed, every truth she'd peeled open with nothing but quiet resolve. She turned off the light and closed the door behind her. That night, she slept. Not peacefully, but purposefully. The kind of sleep that only follows confrontation and the beginning of liberation. The invitation came on a Tuesday. It arrived not through fanfare or applause, but in the soft ping of an email. Subject line: Solo Exhibit Opportunity, Osu Arts Center. Liana stared at the screen for a long moment, her tea going cold on the windowsill. Her name glowed in the body of the email: Liana Ofori, Visual Narrative and Ghanaian Female Perspective. And for the first time in weeks, her breath caught. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was a reckoning. She sat there unmoving, rereading the words over and over, until the cursor blinked like a dare. Her studio had become a sanctuary of silence soaked in emotional residue, unfinished canvases leaning against walls like bodies caught mid-fall. The air smelled of linseed oil metal and something unspoken. And then, without drama, she clicked reply. Yes, 2 letters, a turning point. She told Ethan that night at dinner, when the clink of plates was too loud and the silence between them louder still. "I'm doing an exhibit," she said. He looked up, fork midair. "Really? Osu. Solo showcase. Wow, that's amazing." He smiled. "I'm proud of you." She nodded, said nothing else, because this wasn't about him. This was hers. The next morning, she began to paint like a woman possessed. Not neatly, not carefully, desperately, like someone digging through rubble for a buried voice. Canvas after canvas came alive in her hands. But these were not the whimsical illustrations of the whispering tree, nor the bold female portraits from her earlier career. These paintings bled. There was one of a bird, its wings outstretched mid-flight, caught in invisible tension, the feathers etched with lines of grief. Another showed a tangled mass of wire, no beginning or end, looping like lies told over time. One canvas bore the outline of a music box, cracked open, soft ink dripping from its gears, like memory leaking into reality. But the faces were the hardest. She painted anonymous eyes, haunted wide, half-formed. One face looked disturbingly like Mia, though she hadn't meant to. Another had Ethan's jawline. Another had her own mouth open in a scream she never released. Every day she worked until her fingers cramped. And then she kept working. She barely ate, spoke only when necessary, slept in short bursts. Her skin grew pale, her cheeks hollow. But her eyes, those eyes sharpened with each brushstroke. They became lenses of clarity. And yet, for all her discipline, she couldn't finish the centerpiece. It stood on its own easel, larger than the rest, untouched, a canvas, too clean. It would be the last thing she painted. The most honest. The doorbell rang one afternoon just before sunset. She wiped her hands on a paint-smeared cloth and opened the door. "Hi, Ma." Her mother stood there in a faded kente shawl, a satchel slung across her chest, and eyes full of stories Liana didn't know how to ask about. "I brought yam and Contamire stew," her mother said with a smile that barely hid the concern underneath. "And plantain. You're too thin." "I'm fine," Liana said, but her voice cracked slightly. Her mother stepped inside without asking. There was no need. The apartment smelled of turpentine and tension. Her mother's eyes swept over the half-dried canvases, the disorder, the barely touched tea on the table. "You're painting like it's your last breath," she said softly. Liana sat down on the couch. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Her mother looked at her. Really looked. Liana, what's going on? Liana swallowed. Her chest ached, not from paint fumes, not from fatigue, but from the weight of holding too much alone. Wordlessly, she rose and walked into the studio, pulled open a drawer, handed her mother the folded letter, the one she'd found in the music box weeks ago. Her mother unfolded it slowly, read in silence. The clock ticked. Outside, traffic passed, children shouted in the street. Inside, the world waited. When she finished reading, Liana's mother exhaled a sound that was not quite a sigh, but not relief either. She placed the letter on the table. Then she looked at her daughter and said the simplest, most devastating thing. Silence has a voice too. Liana blinked once, twice, and then her body caved in on itself. Her mother reached for her just as the sob broke loose. A sound Liana hadn't made in years, primal, choking, unfiltered. She collapsed into her mother's arms and wept. For the betrayal. For the dignity she'd clung to too tightly. For the part of her that still wanted someone to tell her it wasn't true. They sat there for what felt like hours. When the storm passed, her mother wiped Liana's cheeks with the edge of her shawl and whispered, "You are allowed to fall, but not to stay broken." Liana nodded, but her voice was gone. Later that evening, after her mother had unpacked the food and insisted on feeding her something, "You need strength to confront ghosts," she'd said. Liana returned to the studio. She stood before the blank canvas, the centerpiece, the only painting she hadn't touched. Until now, she reached for her brushes. She knew what to paint. Not vengeance, not confrontation, but the truth, uncloaked, unadorned. She drew a woman standing in front of a wall of mirrors, every mirror reflecting a different version of herself. Some crying, some screaming, some completely blank, and one smiling, not with joy, but with resignation. Above the woman's head floated a bird perched between two golden cages, both doors wide open, but the bird stayed still. In its eye was a reflection, a pair of human hands gently cupped, offering nothing. Liana worked through the night, layer by layer, line by line. She painted until her arms ached and her breath hitched and her truth lived on the canvas. And when she stepped back sometime before dawn, she knew. This was the final piece. This was her voice. The exhibit would not be revenge. It would be testimony, not just hers, but for every woman who'd ever been loved second. Every sister who'd stood in silence. Every mother who'd carried burdens too heavy to name. It would be art, and it would speak, even when she chose not to. The gallery buzzed with that particular kind of hum, the one born from too many people in one room, dressed in good intentions and uncomfortable shoes. The Osu Art Center glowed under amber lighting, the walls draped in Liana's truth. Her pieces hung like witnesses, silent and unforgiving. There were no plaques with titles, no poetic explanations, just numbers. Numbers that hinted at chronology, at a timeline, at a reckoning. The guests walked the floor slowly, wine glasses in hand, their footsteps muffled by the soft rugs. Critics from Accra's art press whispered in corners. Old friends she hadn't seen in years murmured admiration with furrowed brows. There was tension in the room, not confusion, but anticipation. The feeling you get just before thunder splits the sky. Liana stood at the far end of the gallery, under the spotlight, where the largest canvas hung. It loomed over her, nearly her own height, framed in distressed wood, the image already stopping guests mid-step, a bird, mid-flight, wings wide and ragged, its feathers marked not with patterns but with scars. Below it, two golden cages identical, both open, but neither inviting. In the bird's eye, a reflection of a human face, mouth wide in a silent scream. She had named it privately, the bird that forgot to sing. Publicly it bore no name, no signature. But the painting didn't need one. It spoke without sound. Behind her, the crowd thickened. That's when she saw them. Ethan, first tall, pressed navy suit posture, tense. His eyes scanned the room like a man trying to read a book that used to be familiar. Beside him, Mia, hair tucked into a loose bun, pearl earrings. Her dress simple but deliberate. She clung to the edge of his arm like someone trying not to be seen while already being watched. Liana didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She turned back to the painting. Let them come. Let them stand before it. Let the silence do what words could never touch. "Excuse me," the gallery director whispered to her. "They're ready for your remarks." Liana nodded once. She stepped forward into the hush. The crowd turned shifting toward her with the quiet reverence people reserve for artists who have just peeled themselves open. She didn't use the microphone. Her voice didn't need help. She stood tall, centered herself, and began. "This piece," she gestured slightly without looking at it, "is about a bird. Not one that was caged, but one that forgot how to sing." Murmurs stilled. The world always imagines freedom as a door flung wide, wings catching air flight. But what happens when the cage isn't closed? When you're free to go, but your voice, your music, is buried beneath silence. Her eyes scanned the room, paused briefly, not long enough to accuse on Ethan. Then Mia. "It's not a painting about betrayal, or grief, or even forgiveness," she breathed in slow and full. "It's about the moment a person realizes they were never the author of their own story." You could hear a pin drop. "It's about rewriting it." Liana stepped back then, said nothing else. And yet everything had been said. The guests turned toward the painting again, now reading it differently. Seeing the cracks, the weight, the heartbreak painted into feathered strokes. Ethan stood frozen. His face twitched as if holding back some collapsing part of himself. Mia took a step backward, then another. Her eyes glistened not in rage, not in shame, but in recognition. Recognition that this painting wasn't vengeance. It was memory, fixed, framed, unmovable. Ethan blinked rapidly, his jaw clenched. One hand rose as if to gesture to protest, to call her name, but no sound came. A tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Mia turned quietly, her heels making no sound on the gallery floor. No one stopped her. She didn't look back. She slipped out into the street alone. And for the first time in years, Liana didn't follow. She didn't ask why. She didn't apologize for the aftermath of someone else's silence. The crowd soon broke into soft conversations, as if by unspoken agreement. The air shifted. People approached the other pieces now, timid, reverent. But Liana remained where she was, beside the bird. Beside herself. Ethan walked toward her. Slowly, she watched him come every step await. He stopped a few feet away. Didn't speak right away. Then, voice low, eyes red, he said, "I didn't know you knew." She held his gaze. "I did," she said, "and then I painted it. I never meant for it to. I know. I never stopped." She cut him off. "This isn't for us." He swallowed hard. "It was always going to end here," she said. He nodded. A silence passed between them. This one different. It wasn't loaded. It wasn't begging. It was acknowledgement. Then Ethan turned and walked away. He didn't look back. Neither did she. She remained by the painting as the gallery emptied around her, as the wine ran dry, as the night pressed gently against the windows. When only the faint jazz from the speakers remained, she finally sat. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked up at the bird and whispered, "You're free now." The knock came just after sunset. 3 soft taps against wood, hesitant, too polite to be desperate, too late to be casual. Liana didn't need to ask who it was. She stood in her hallway for a moment, fingers resting on the edge of the doorframe, her breath a slow, steady rhythm. The air inside the apartment still carried the scent of paint, lavender, and something older, closure perhaps. She opened the door. Ethan stood there, dressed in the same shirt he'd worn the night of the exhibition, now slightly wrinkled. His eyes were tired, his face unshaven. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, who had spent the hours since drowning and everything left unsaid. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. Liana didn't move aside. Instead, she studied him. "You don't have to say anything," he offered, "but I need to." She opened the door wider, just enough. He stepped in. The apartment felt different, emptier. Some of the art was gone from the walls. The bookshelves had gaps in them. The room itself held its breath. Ethan stood awkwardly by the dining table like a guest who didn't recognize the house he once helped build. "I came to say I'm sorry," he began. Liana sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "I know. I should have told you," he continued, voice cracking slightly. "From the beginning. I thought if I buried it deep enough, if I never spoke her name, maybe it would stay in the past. But it didn't. It lived between us, even when I tried to forget it." She didn't interrupt. "I thought I loved you purely," he said. "And maybe I did. But love that starts with a lie, it never gets clean." His eyes searched hers for something, forgiveness maybe, or permission to forgive himself. She reached beside her and picked up a small envelope from the coffee table. It was cream-colored thick paper, sealed with a wax stamp she had melted herself. She held it out. He didn't take it immediately. "What is it?" he asked. "A letter," she said. "Not for you to understand, just for me to remember." He took it slowly, looking down at the weightless thing that somehow carried everything. "I don't hate you," she said softly, "but I won't carry this anymore." Ethan's throat bobbed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he watched as Liana stood, walked to the small wooden table near the hallway, and opened a carved music box, the same one that had once held Esther's letter. Without a word, she slid the wedding ring from her finger, set it gently inside, closed the lid. The music played softly, an old lullaby that now sounded like the sound of letting go. Ethan's shoulders slumped. "Is there anything I can say?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "No," she said, "and that's okay." He nodded once, twice, turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "You were the best part of my life, Liana." She didn't reply. Some truths didn't need echo. He left without closing the door fully. The silence he left behind was thick, but not heavy. It was the kind of quiet that followed truth, not absence, but space. She stood alone in the middle of the room. Then slowly she began to pack. There was no rush, no panic, no escape. Just a decision. Books into boxes, canvases into crates, sketch pads stacked in order. She handled each item not like a refugee, but like a curator. Every fold of clothing, every object wrapped in newspaper was an act of reclamation. She wasn't running. She was choosing. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Liana's apartment looked more like a hotel room. Bare walls, clean counters. The music box, still on the table, closed silent. She took one last look around, then picked up her bag. The car was already waiting. She'd arranged it through a friend of her mother's, someone who drove long-distance deliveries between Accra and the surrounding villages. Ajena wasn't far, just far enough to begin again. As the city peeled away behind her, replaced by fields and clusters of baobab trees, Liana sat in the back seat with the window cracked open, letting the wind pull strands of her hair loose. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed. When they arrived, the house was waiting. A single-story cottage at the edge of the Ajena Ridge, with terracotta tiles and flowering vines that had wrapped themselves stubbornly around the porch beams. The air smelled of soil rain and hibiscus. Her mother had already stocked the pantry, fresh ginger in the corner. "And your papers on the desk," she had said on the phone the night before. The inside of the cottage was humble 2 rooms, 1 desk, and more light than she knew what to do with. She unpacked slowly. Then she opened her sketch pad, not to escape, to remember. Her first drawing in Ajena was of a woman standing in a river holding a basket full of ink. Her feet were submerged, but her hands were clean. The water around her was alive with fish, each one shaped like a word she had once swallowed. The second drawing was of herself, bare-faced eyes open a crack down her sternum from which a tree bloomed. She titled the series, "What Remains After Silence." Day by day, her new story unfolded. Not as vengeance, not even as healing, but as authorship. The art that came from her hands now was quieter, deeper. She blended folklore with confession myth, with memory. Her new comic was rooted in Ghanaian oral tradition about a girl who could only speak in birdsong and how she was mistaken for mad, until the elders realized she was translating pain. She worked in the mornings, walked the red dirt roads in the afternoons, and sat under moonlight at night, listening to the stories the wind told through the leaves. No one asked her why she came to Ajena. No one needed to. She had come not to hide, but to live fully outside the framework of anyone else's expectations. One evening, as she watched the sun slide into the edge of the horizon, her mother called. "How are you?" she asked. Liana smiled, holding her sketch pad close. "I'm writing my life back." And for the first time in a long time, the words felt true. The auditorium wasn't grand. No gold leaf ceilings or velvet chairs. It smelled faintly of shea butter and old paper, with a few ceiling fans humming in slow circles overhead. Rows of folding chairs formed a modest audience in the heart of Kumasi's Women's Center for Community and Creative Empowerment. On the wall behind the podium was a single banner made from hand-painted cloth. It read, "The Power of Silence, a Conversation on Dignity." Liana sat in the second row, knees together, palms flat on her skirt. Her name was on the program final speaker, listed simply as visual storyteller, Ajana. No last name, no background bio. She'd asked for it that way. The room filled with women. Young old in colorful Kaaba dresses, slacks, head wraps, braids, some with notepads, others with weary eyes that said they didn't come for notes. They came for something else, a way forward, a mirror, a beginning. When Liana was called to the front, she didn't walk like someone who had planned a speech. She walked like someone who had spent months learning how to breathe, without apologizing for taking space. The microphone didn't work, so she spoke without it, and they heard her. I once lived a story that wasn't mine. She began, her voice low but unwavering. I was given a script, handed a stage dressed in lines of devotion and silence. And I performed. For years. There were no gasps, just stillness. I won't say names, because this isn't about who. It's about how. Her fingers touched the edge of the podium. I trusted. I built. I poured. I created a home with someone whose truth had a different foundation. I loved, loudly. But I lived beside people who whispered. Heads nodded slowly throughout the room. I found out the truth not by confrontation, but by accident. A letter. A silence that had waited too long to be heard. I didn't break glass. I didn't burn down the house. I chose instead to open a window. She smiled faintly. I left that house. Someone in the second row wiped her eyes. I didn't leave in anger. I left in clarity. Liana reached into her bag and pulled out a small canvas no bigger than a school notebook. She held it up. On it, a bird sat still between two open cages. Around it, silence. I painted this after the truth came out. I didn't write a letter. I didn't scream. I painted. A pause. She placed the canvas gently on the podium and stepped away from the microphone stand entirely. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is a decision not to dignify dishonesty with a response. Sometimes silence is the sound of dignity healing itself. A hush swept across the hall. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full. I was called passive, even weak. But I left. I healed. And I learned when women walk away with their head held high and their soul intact, even betrayal has to bow. Then she finished with one sentence. Quiet. But enough. I am not broken. I am rebuilding in my own voice. She stepped down from the podium, and before she could return to her seat, the first woman approached late 30s, a baby strapped to her back. She didn't speak, just embraced Liana tightly. Then another, and another. A line formed. Some women whispered, "I've been there." Others said, "That was me." One woman, maybe 60 eyes ringed with years of disappointment, simply whispered, "I stayed. But now I want to go." Liana held every woman who reached for her. Not like a hero, like a mirror. When the room cleared, a young man approached her near the refreshments table holding a card. He introduced himself as a producer from a small animation studio in Accra. "I saw your story through your work," he said. "And I think others need to see it too." Liana blinked. "See what exactly?" He pointed to the canvas now resting in her arms. That bird. That silence. The truth beneath both. He handed her a concept brief. "Would you let us turn your story into a short, animated piece? Just 10 minutes. A story for Ghanaian girls who don't yet know that they have permission to walk away." Liana looked down at the paper, then at the room. Then she nodded. Yes, not because she needed to be seen, but because others still needed to know they weren't invisible. That night back in Ajina, Liana sat on the porch with a cup of cocoa, her sketch pad open on her lap. The stars above her blinked like distant witnesses, and the wind carried the low sound of drums from somewhere across the ridge. She drew not a bird this time, but a woman. Her eyes were open, her mouth closed, and around her head, a crown made of silence. Meanwhile in Accra, whispers traveled. Not cruel, not scandalized, but real. People who once praised Ethan and Mia as a power couple now tilted their heads differently when their names were mentioned. They were close, you know. Someone would say over drinks. Before the marriage. "You mean?" "Yeah, something like that. But what about?" I heard she knew. The wife. I heard she left, quietly, like a queen. There were no headlines, no viral takedowns, just a quiet shift in respect. Liana's story, though unnamed, had changed the way people looked at charm when it came wrapped in convenience. At beauty built on borrowed pieces. She didn't chase that shift. She didn't even acknowledge it, but it followed her. In the hands of girls who read her comic. In the silence of women who came to her exhibitions and stayed longer at the painting with the 2 cages. And in the hearts of those who finally realized that some stories aren't meant to end with applause. They're meant to end with peace. The sea was quieter here. Not silent, but softer, like it had known how to scream once and now preferred to hum. The sand was dark with salt, and wind carried the scent of charcoal fires and coconut oil. Liana hadn't been back to this village in nearly 6 years, not since Esther's burial. She parked the borrowed car under a palm tree at the edge of the road, dust kicking up around the tires. The sun was low, casting the sky in orange and mauve. She stepped out slowly, a small wooden box cradled in her arms. It was the music box, the one that had cracked open her world and stitched it back together in a different shape. The cemetery lay at the top of a grassy hill overlooking the water. No gates, just footpaths, weather-worn stones, and names nearly faded by time. Esther Agumang's headstone stood in the corner beneath a neem tree. Liana approached. The box felt warm in her palms, like it remembered its own secret. She crouched slowly before the grave and placed the box down, centered neatly above the engraved name. For a moment, she simply stared. Then she said softly, "I know now." The breeze picked up. "I know what you were trying to protect, and what you didn't know how to fix." She paused. "I forgive you." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. She stood, wiped her palms on her skirt, and turned toward the path that curved back into the village. Toward a house that smelled of roasted corn and warm cassava. Toward her grandmother. The compound hadn't changed. Same stone walls, same veranda where mangoes ripened in baskets, same chickens strutting like gossiping old women. Her grandmother was sitting under the almond tree, a scarf wrapped high around her head. The same silver bangles jingling faintly as she stirred a bowl of herbs. Chale Nana Afua called out before Liana even spoke, "You walk too light these days. Like someone carrying things that can't be seen." Liana smiled faintly and walked over. She sat on the woven mat beside her grandmother and rested her head on her lap. They sat in silence for several minutes. The kind of silence that was not awkward, but ancestral. Then, without prompting, her grandmother said, "Have I ever told you the story of the woman who knew how to sing without a sound?" Liana closed her eyes. "No. She lived in a village like this." Nana Afua began, her voice low and rhythmic, like the tide. Everyone thought she was mute. She never shouted, never argued. But every night when the world slept, her voice traveled through the trees. Not in words, in music. Soft, old music. Like a lullaby passed down by rivers. Liana inhaled slowly. No one knew what she sang about. But the women in the village started dreaming better. Their husbands came home less angry. Their daughters stopped asking for less. Her grandmother brushed a strand of hair from Liana's face, and when she died, the people didn't cry. They listened. Because her silence had taught them more than the village elder's loudest sermon. She smiled. "You remind me of her." Liana opened her eyes, throat tight. But she was alone. No child. She was followed. She became legend. And legend is never lonely. It becomes lineage. The almond leaves rustled above them, casting dancing shadows across the mat. "You, my dear Nana Afua," said, "are part of a line of women who chose not to burn the house down, but to plant gardens beside the ashes. You don't scream, but you make people listen." Tears slipped from Liana's eyes, slow, unannounced. Her grandmother pulled her close, and for the first time in all her years, Liana cried like a child in the arms of the woman who remembered her before she even knew her own name. They stayed like that as the light faded. When they rose to go inside, Liana looked back toward the sea, toward the hill, toward the place where a music box rested beside a name. The breeze shifted again, and carried with it not just air, but song. No words, just a melody, old, carried by the bones of Ghanaian women who had walked before her, and now through her. Still walking, the bookstore in Osu was packed tighter than anyone expected. The launch had been quiet, no massive marketing push, no social media countdown. Just a handwritten invitation posted in the window 3 weeks before new graphic novel, Liana Ofori, When Lies Learn to Weep. There was something about the title that stopped people in their tracks, and then word spread. By the time the doors opened that Saturday morning, the room was full of young women holding notebooks, older women clutching the edges of their handbags. Students, artists, journalists, and men, too and quiet but curious. They came not just for the book, but for the author, for the story that had begun to ripple long before it had a cover. Liana sat at a simple table near the window, her curls tied back with a cloth band. No stage, no microphone. Just her, a stack of books and a pen that trembled slightly in her hand. The first copy was signed for a girl no older than 12. Her mother stood behind her, eyes rimmed with tears. "I read your interview." In the Standard, the woman whispered. "You gave us language?" Liana smiled gently and handed the book back. "I just told the truth. The comic wasn't an exact retelling. It was myth. Allegory. A world where a songbird loses her voice after falling in love with a mirror. She spends years trying to sing again, mistaking her silence for weakness, until one day, she realizes the silence was never empty. It was waiting. By the end of the book, the bird doesn't confront the mirror. She simply flies past it. People cried when they read it, not because it was sad, but because it was honest. By afternoon, the last copy was gone. The publisher had to send for more. A small local animation studio announced they were adapting it for a miniseries. NGO workers began handing it out at women's shelters. It became a story passed hand to hand, sister to sister. But Liana didn't stay for the applause. By sundown, she was gone. She walked alone through the streets of Accra, through the scattered hum of night markets and gospel choirs, rehearsing behind shuttered storefronts. She carried only her sketchpad and a pouch of pencils. No fanfare. No final speech. Just peace. She reached the edge of Labadi Beach as the sky turned indigo, the tide brushing the shore in slow, forgiving waves. The horizon blurred into itself, sky and sea sharing the same breath. She sat on the sand, letting her toes dig into the earth. The city lights were far enough to forget. The noise far enough to let go. She opened the sketchpad, drew a bird. This time the wings were wide, open, mid-flight, not caught between cages, not suspended in fear, but rising. The lines came easy now. No hesitation in her wrist, no weight in her elbow. Just fluid motion. A rhythm, a heartbeat rendered in graphite. She shaded the feathers with a kind of softness she hadn't known before. Then from her bag, she pulled out the old music box. It was chipped now, the edges worn, but it still opened. She turned the tiny brass key. The melody drifted into the dusk, faint, weathered, but whole. She listened, smiled, then closed her eyes. The sea wind danced around her, lifting curls from her forehead, wrapping itself in the pages of her sketchpad. And in that moment, quiet, salt-kissed still, she whispered, "It doesn't need to end with anger. It only needs to end with peace." The tide inched closer, not to take, but to witness. And when the sky darkened fully, when the stars blinked back into view, when the night accepted her surrender, the screen in her mind went still. The story had ended, but she had not. She had begun.